We have another very exciting talk by Garett. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University and chief economist at Blue Chip Stablecoin Ratings. And today he will talk about how selecting for IQ can boost global innovation. So, Garett?
Well, my thesis is very simple, which is that smart people are disproportionately likely to create world-changing, world-improving technologies. And modern embryo selection can increase the fraction of newborn children who are likely to create such technological miracles. And this means this is a reason for the entire world, regardless of which country one lives in, to welcome embryo selection technologies used voluntarily. The rest of the talk here is really just going to be about putting numbers to this. So a lot of people have speculated about this. What I do here is I bring together research from intelligence research, from genomics research, and from modern economic growth theory to put some numbers to this very important idea. So my first book on IQ, I wrote a book on IQ a few years ago for Stanford University Press. And the subtitle was How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own. One of the graphs from it showed up in an earlier talk today. I was very honored by that. And so my story is that basically smart neighbors are good for all of us. It's better to be the smart fish. It's better to be the dumb fish in a smart pond than the smart fish in a dumb pond, right? You want smart neighbors around you, partly because they make smarter voters, they make better bureaucracies, and smarter people are more frugal, so you get higher savings rates. Johnny Anomaly, who spoke here yesterday, was my co-author on a paper that got me thinking about, through his work, got me thinking about how cognitive enhancement should actually be morally welcomed by those around us. Because if a society's prosperity is driven largely by group traits, then it's good for parents to try to, as we put it here in the paper, preserve or enhance cognitive traits that have positive network effects, positive spillovers, positive externalities. So it's basically making the point that if embryonic selection or other voluntary scientific methods can help make your kids smarter, that's good for a parent to do. It's morally welcome, and it should be welcomed by all of us, not just by those parents. So that was my first foray into this general question of embryo selection and prosperity. Today's talk, which I call Twice the Miracles, is about changes in IQ and how a higher global IQ boosts global innovation. And the reason we should welcome that is because national boundaries don't matter much in the world of ideas. Ideas eventually spread globally. Calculus, Newton invented the calculus in England, and anybody can use it anywhere in the world, right? And this is the way technological diffusion works. Ideas diffuse, and then ideas are often embodied in machines that people around the world can use. Even if people in a certain country could never have built a smartphone or a sphygmomanometer, they can actually use that technology invented somewhere else long ago. So ideas diffuse. Knowledge wants to be free globally. So this is my first time really writing about this global, or thinking about this global question. So my story here, just to overview it, is that modern work shows that Mr. Anomaly has summed up. He says that embryo selection can plausibly add 5 IQ points per child in the very near future, perhaps today. This leads to a doubling of top 1% IQ births, as I'll show in a little bit later. It's just drawing on a normal distribution. And that turned out to be hugely important for research and development, since top 1%ers are wildly disproportionately likely to come up with the great ideas that all of us have benefited from that are created in the past. I give a back of the envelope estimate that I think is still credible, because you'll get to watch each link in the chain. I don't just pull this out of a hat. A single couple, a relatively high IQ couple that chooses embryo selection, could generate a net present value contribution to global innovation, just looking at that global innovation effect, not the smarter neighbors, not the frugal folks, worth between $160,000 and $730,000 in today's net present value dollars. It's actually much bigger, but since these benefits are all out there in the future, people are a little impatient. So $1 million 10 years from now isn't worth as much as $1 million today. I think these estimates understate the case. If I have time, I'll go into that. Some of it will just be kind of obvious along the way, which means that everyone should welcome embryo selection. I should welcome embryo selection in Denmark, in Germany, in Taiwan. I should welcome it around the world, regardless of where I'm living, especially if I have a long time horizon. So the interventions for embryo selection, if you look at some academic research, people say, well, 2 to 3 IQ points is what you can get. I could have written this paper with that number too. But I decided 5 because I think that's state of the art. Second, I take a normal distribution and I say, well, 5 IQ points can roughly double the probability of surpassing these key IQ thresholds. I pick 3, 130, 140, 150. You can choose your own adventure. I'm going to put a lot of weight on the number 142 because that's a cutoff at the top 1/4 of 1%. Top 1/4 of 1% is where my numbers are going to come from later. So that's 142. So, you know, one of the for high IQ couples, one of the curses of human genetics is mean reversion, and that means that if a couple has an average IQ of 130, on average you'd expect their kids to have an average IQ of 118, and that's, you know, still above average, but it's not 100. So I mean, it's not 130. So let me focus on this top table here, which is those are the folks I'm going to talk about. So if folks, let's talk about just the probability of having a kid with an IQ above 130. If you have kids the old-fashioned way, and the couple has an average IQ of 130, about 11% of any of children that they have will have an IQ of greater than 130. 11% will have IQs greater than their own on average. If instead they just used a embryo selection method that only increased its average IQ by 5 points, just 5 points, then about 1/3 of their kids would have IQs higher than their own average. So you're going from 11% to 32%. I mean, this is basically the shape, because of the shape of the bell curve, right? You shift it over, if it's that steep part, you just get a huge chunk of mass right there. The other numbers are a little smaller than that, but they're all basic, they're all forms of doubling, right? So shifting from just modest embryo selection to comparing that to the natural way of having kids, seems to, on average, double the number of people that'll be above any of these interesting thresholds. And the folks in these categories, as I said, are disproportionately likely to create miracles. Robert Lucas, Nobel laureate in economics, he wrote a paper about technological progress called Making a Miracle. That's the way we economists see technological progress. We still have terrible ways for modeling it, for, you know, mathing it up. Sometimes you should just remember, it's a miracle. So next link in my chain here comes from endogenous growth theory. So in the long run, economic growth comes from growth in the stock of ideas for rich countries. You know, China's doing a lot of catch up, India's doing a lot of catch up, but what they're learning to do is they're learning to do what's been done elsewhere with some unique local twists. When we ask, why do economies grow at the frontier? Robert Solow, Nobel laureate, taught us that you can't explain long-run growth by just capital accumulation. Eventually, it's just so hard to maintain all that capital stock that a country can't permanently grow through capital accumulation, through high savings rates. It has to be that we're somehow getting as Paul Romer puts it, a bigger recipe book, a better recipe book for combining the ingredients that already exist on the planet. And so that means that all long-run growth is due to growth in some stock of ideas. And so if we want to talk about the names to think about here, it's Paul Romer, Joseph Schumpeter, Chad Jones of Stanford, all making this claim that R&D is the key channel that shapes that. Research and development, the things you can measure both happening in the private sector and the public sector, are absolutely crucial for increasing this stock of ideas. Another thing to wonder about, though, is who is actually likely to create that R&D, make that R&D contribution. You might just think, well, maybe anybody can do it. You know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Who knows? There's serendipity in the world. Lubinsky, the psychologist, has followed a group of mathematically precocious young folks for decades and followed them up into adulthood and checked to see how they did. And what he found was that people in the top 1% in IQ identified as children, usually at age 13. They do much more R&D, they produce more patents, they get more STEM PhDs, they just do a lot more of the things that are likely to make the world more prosperous. Far truer for the top 1/4%. And then the late William Baumol, who should have won a Nobel Prize but didn't. Some of my colleagues in the department always had him on the short list. he wrote a number of books about and articles about R&D and GDP growth. He made the case that essentially all GDP growth per capita comes from formal R&D. I'm going to take his idea seriously, but I'm only going to, in the economist style, I'm going to take it half seriously. I'm going to assume that only half of growth in long-run GDP per capita comes from formal R&D. So I'm trying not to overstate my case. So half of the growth that we see in the long run in the rich countries comes from the downstream effects of formal R&D. So here's the equation. The rest of this talk is a bunch of equations. Sorry. Or congratulations, depending on your tastes. Yeah. So the annual value of one researcher. First, I'm going to talk about the annual value of one researcher doing some research. If we're taking Baumel's idea half seriously, that's what that half is for, then what I do is I look at total GDP growth that happens in 1 year for the planet. So the global economy has $110 trillion. So per capita growth in the rich countries is 1.8%. So I'm taking 1.8% of $110 trillion. Half of that global GDP growth is what is created by these researchers, half that. And then so I divide it by the number of researchers. The thing is, innovations help forever. Either that innovation lasts itself and people are literally using that innovation, or it spurs subsequent secondary, tertiary, quaternary innovations. Multiple innovations get built on past innovations. This is a big theme of Levine and Boldrin's case against actually patents, actually. This is common in the literature to just say, let's just say every miracle created by an inventor de facto lasts forever, directly or indirectly. You know, few of us use Newton's notation for calculus, but we still know that it was his calculus, right? So to discount that, I have to treat it as annuity. So I divide it by 1 over the interest rate. And I'm going to use 2 interest rates, 4%, which is the socially acceptable interest rate, and then 2%, which is the long-termist interest rate, because I care more about the future than the financial markets do. So we got $2 trillion of growth each year, of output each year created through innovation. And I estimated that there are 6 million R&D workers globally. I give Chinese workers a slightly lower weight, half weight actually, because it's a lower productivity country. And but 6 million workers, it's basically 1%. It's 1% of the workers in all the rich countries, plus an add-on for China. So that's Chad Jones' estimate that basically 1% of all the workers in the rich countries are working in R&D work, private or public sector. So I use two different discount rates. As those of you who work in finance know, you can justify anything you want to with the right discount rate. My colleague Tyler Cowen is a big-time long-termist in his writings on the social discount rate. He thinks that we should think of it as 0 for the very long run. And maybe something like 4% for the shorter run. I think 2% is a nice way to straddle the two positions, and especially just a way of saying, yeah, I think saving 1 billion lives a century from now should actually count for something. So if I plug those numbers in, what I get is each researcher, the average researcher, is creating $8.25 million in value at a 2% discount rate. And it only drops in half when I switch it to 4% discount rate. So $4 million. Like, that's just huge, right? And so obviously this is the point that Baumel made, which is that researchers are overwhelmingly creating externalities, right? Researchers, as those of you who work in R&D know, the average person who works in this field does not make that much money, right? So this means that overwhelmingly the benefits of innovation are externalities. They're spillovers. They're things that people are not paying for, that they're getting. I mean, we're still reaping the rewards of calculus, even though it's free. That's one version of it, right? So Baumel pushes us in this direction of innovation being all about a world of massive externalities, which is what people in the field think about. The thing is that the researcher doesn't just do that for 1 year. The researcher does that for every year in a 30-year career. Right? So 1 year you're creating this miracle, one of these miracles, and then you have a 30-year career, so you're creating that miracle 30 times. Now these numbers are just absolutely astronomical. And the funny thing is, this is what you get used to when you start doing R&D economic growth research. You're like, these numbers are that's just crazy big. And so I know you might want to like find ways to cut it back by half or a fourth or a tenth, and you're like, it's still going to be a huge number. Sorry, right? So I have to discount these because a lot of that money's in the future. So I discount it by 2 or 4%. And so these numbers automatically start getting shrunk to 100 million or about $25 million. So when we look at what I'm going to go off Lubinsky's work, because Lubinsky, his coolest findings are just for people in the top 0.25%. So I'm not going to look at the 130s. I'm not using the 130 cutoff. I'm not even using the 140 cutoff. I'm saying the only people, this is where I'm being conservative in my estimates, one of the places. The only people in my story here, the only people who are created through embryo selection who actually create these massive global benefits, they're all people who are just in that, have those IQs above 142. Very conservative estimate. So, and drawing on Lubinsky's work, I say 14% of these kids do R&D, do serious R&D. That's kind of what Lubinsky found for STEM publications and patenting. 30% of people in that top 0.25% get some kind of PhD, but some people get PhDs in meaningless fields like me in economics, so that aren't adding to the global stock of knowledge. So now we take these numbers. So we're saying 5 IQ point gain, a 5 percentage point. Embryo selection raises the probability of having one of these super elite kids by 5 percentage points. So the probability of a miracle kid raises by only 5 percentage points, because it's a really small 142, like IQ 142, small group. So 5 percentage point increase, and then there's a 14% chance they go into the field that actually changes the world. So that's a less than 1% chance of this birth actually changing the world of R&D, right? So when I multiply that less than 1% by the value of the researcher, which is, so that's where I get these two numbers. So 0.07% times those two numbers from before, that's where you get 730,000 at the 2% discount rate, 160,000 at the 4% discount rate. That right there is your value to the planet as a whole. And that's a big enough number that even if you were just living in a big country like the United States or just China, you'd say like, well, my country gets a whole lot of that benefit because it eventually diffuses here. So if you're a nationalist, an economic nationalist, you should still be very excited about like the benefits of these innovations from embryonic selection happening somewhere else, even though those are going to happen very far in the future. Again, why have I understated this? I've understated it because one example of how I understated is only credit half of GDP growth to R&D. I ignored all of the other things that smart people do, right? I ignored the fact that they're often top managers helping organizations run well. They might not be coded as an R&D researcher in a formal network, but they might be running a company that does a lot of great R&D and helping it work better. I'm ignoring all the great things done by the top 5%, top 2%, rest of the top 1%. I'm ignoring all that. So those are pretty, I think reasonably understated, and maybe the 4% discount rate is still too small. So again, so to sum it all up here, embryo selection plausibly adds 5 IQ points per child. I think that's like that's coming from the world of genetic research. Normal distribution tells me the second line. Modern R&D research and economic growth tells me the third line. And then just me putting in some reasonable numbers following just as the first ballpark estimate, the first back of the envelope estimate the world has seen, we're seeing numbers like 160 to 730K, depending on how much you value the future. So what this means is that everyone in the world should value voluntary genomic selection, voluntary embryonic selection being done anywhere in the world if they have a long-run view of the future. If you care about the world your children and grandchildren live in, you should be happy to have anyone anywhere in the world doing some voluntary embryo selection on intelligence. It means we get more economic miracles, and economic miracles are what give us a healthier, more prosperous future. Thanks.
We only have time for one question, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe the one where you've got the best opinion, but so I'm curious, a lot of this is about adding intelligence into a system, right? And so when I think about this, I think a lot about IQ, but I also think a lot about AI. Makes sense.
Yes,
the time that we're in. So I'm curious if you've got colleagues, metrics, ways that you're approaching that look particularly good. I also am curious if you have thoughts about selection above 160, which is going to be a little quirkier, I think, than at sort of 100, 130. And then What's missing here to me, especially since you mentioned Schumpeter, is of course founder-led invention, which is going to be different from straight up corporate R&D and academic R&D. And so pick one. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, they're all great questions. I think I can say something credible about the first one. Economists have thought hard about whether AI will basically be the equivalent of adding extra really smart people by the millions and millions. So if we only have 6 million R&D researchers right now in the world, and each of them ends up managing, if like half of them end up managing 3 bots each that are basically good AIs, you're already basically coming up to double, triple easily the number of R&D researchers in the world. The question is whether we get there in the very near future. I do think that will happen personally, and I'd say Chad Jones is the person who's thought the most about this. He's been writing about this for quite some time, and then Eric Brynjolfsson has been thinking about this for decades. He's now at Stanford, started off at MIT. So I'd say those are the two people. Brynjolfsson has gotten better has moved more into the world of business consulting, business management, doing fundraisers. Chad is still a nerdy academic, which both are great ways to learn about this. I think it's going to change the world. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Garett.